You would state your name and
Mr. Chairman and Senators, my name is Bob Rose, and I'm a meteorologist with the LCRA. And I've been asked to give a quick review of the weather events that took place the last week and a half. And I'll direct you to the slides on the screen if we can go to the next slide. This event that we went through was very historical. It joins just a handful of very extremely cold weather events in Texas history. And I'll talk a little bit about how this came about and its evolution, how we went through it, and then how we came out. I want to give you a brief timeline of how this all unfolded, and I'm going to get into a little bit more detail here in a minute. But the Arctic air first began to arrive in Texas before last week. It was really around that Wednesday or Thursday. It was really around the 12th when the temperature started to cool down across the state. In fact, here in central Texas, we began to see ice accumulating on many of the objects, sometimes a quarter, even up to a half inch of ice in and around the Austin and central Texas area. We continued in very cold temperatures going into the weekend, but then the very bitterly cold Arctic air arrived on that Sunday, and that set the stage for that extremely cold week. We saw about 2 or 3 waves of bitterly cold air which followed that initial wave on Sunday. And that continued all the way through the week. We didn't come out of this until late in the week at about Friday and then going into the weekend. One other aspect of the storm besides the bitterly cold temperatures was also the precipitation. We saw extremely heavy snow in many parts of the state, everywhere from South Texas all the way up toward North Texas and even into East Texas as well. And with that, I was going to talk just a little bit about how this whole event came about. We go to the next slide. You know, meteorologists began to see a changing in the weather pattern in late December, early January. And if you're following some of the news accounts, this is a time when we saw the stratosphere over the top of the globe start to really warm. We saw the temperatures rising by about 90 degrees at times. And this is what's called a sudden stratospheric warming event. And we see these happen about once every 1 to 4 years. They're not all that uncommon. But this started developing again in early January. And what happens with these type of events is they often will influence the polar vortex, which is down in the lower part of the atmosphere in the area where we live. And in many cases, it can disturb the polar vortex to a way that it allows very cold air to flow south. Now, early on, we don't know where that cold air is going to flow. It could flow into Asia. It could flow into Europe. It could flow out toward the Pacific. You know, it wasn't early in January. We didn't know. We didn't have any clues it would be flowing toward North America. As we started getting more toward the early February, we started seeing signs that this was going to begin affecting that polar vortex over the northern hemisphere. And we're starting to see some clues that it was going to be directed more toward North America. One of the things that made this unique is that we saw a ridge of high pressure developing out near Greenland and another ridge of high pressure that began developing out toward the Gulf of Alaska. With those two ridges poking up toward the North Pole, it allowed this trough to develop right through the mid portion of the country. And with that, it directed air from Siberia come over the pole and down into North America. Air in the Siberian area, as you know, is bitterly cold. And this, as this event took place, this bitterly cold air came right over the poles, right across Canada, and all the way into Texas. It's a unique event. We don't see this happen very often. So it allowed some of the coldest temperatures we've ever seen move into the Lone Star State. On this image I have right here, you can see how the jet stream was kind of disturbed. You see that large dip in the jet stream, the blue area that came all the way down into Texas. This is where that mass of cold air, which normally is up around the polar region, was allowed to escape and spread down to Texas. And again, this is something that's somewhat unique, that it came this far south and came from the other side of the world. We don't see this happening in most winters here in Texas. So we'll move on to look at the next slide here. I wanted to go through day by day, if you can see on here, the temperatures We're looking at maximum temperatures and minimum temperatures. And I wanted to start with Sunday, and I wanted to go through the end of the week there. Sunday, again, was the day that bitterly cold air began to arrive in Texas. Now, it was already cold, like I mentioned. We had already seen our first wave of Arctic air move in, and temperatures are running generally in the 20s and 30s across much of the state on Saturday and through much of Sunday. It was late Sunday that bitterly cold air swept south through much of Texas. It was pushing all the way out into the Gulf of Mexico. So here on Sunday, you can see that high temperatures were generally in the 20s and 30s across the state. It was darn cold. If we go ahead to the next slide, you can see on Monday, notice how the temperatures start to change. Notice that area of purple there on the right-hand side coming all the way down into the northern half of Texas. We were really starting to feel the effects of that bitterly cold air. Temperatures in the teens now we're already covering a good portion of the state. Moving to the next slide, this is Tuesday, and notice now about 2/3 of Texas is covered up with these bitterly cold temperatures, the temperatures getting down into the single digits, into the teens. As we move into Wednesday, there was some improvement, but not that much. Temperatures were still mostly in the teens and 20s across a good portion of the state. If we look at Thursday, the next slide, you can see that we were more or less the same, still locked into a bitterly cold pattern. Not quite as cold as where we were on Monday or Tuesday, but still quite cold, and we're starting to come out of it. And then as we get toward Friday, you notice that the coldest air was out of here. Okay, we can move on and look at the next slide. Another way to look at this is a sequence of looking at the weather over this week. This is average temperatures, looking at the average temperatures across the state. And you can see as we progress, Monday is in the upper right. That's where the time frame is, and then you can see Tuesday through Friday on the bottom slides. I'll point you, I know you probably can't see it, in the upper left is the average temperature computed across the state for that day. And I have it circled up there in red. The average temperature for that day was 11.6 degrees for Texas. Amazingly cold. Now again, this was averaged all across the state, but for everywhere from the Panhandle to the Valley, from El Paso to Beaumont, everywhere in between to be averaging 11.6 degrees, that is phenomenal. Phenomenally cold day. And Tuesday was just a bit warmer than that. But Monday, statewide, was the coldest day. Tuesday is when much of Texas did record its coldest temperatures, but we saw some warming out in the west and down toward the valley that helped boost that average temperature up just a little bit. But still, we're talking about still about the same neighborhood. This is among some of the coldest one-day temperatures we've recorded statewide in Texas. It was just bitterly, bitterly cold. We'll move on and talk on to the next slide right now. I wanted to show you these were the lowest observed temperatures. And again, I apologize that you can't probably see the detail. This is of the entire event. If you look at 11th through the 17th and look across Texas, those colors there are coordinated with low temperatures. And what we saw is the area of that first shade of purple along the Red River and down toward the Dallas-Fort Worth area, temperatures getting down to somewhere between 0 and about 5 below 0. As you move on south from there to Waco, you see temperatures in down to Austin, you see temperatures in the low single digits. You move on south toward the Houston area and down toward San Antonio, you see temperatures down around 5 to 10 degrees. This was an amazingly bitterly cold air mass. So I just want to kind of put that in perspective, that this was all of Texas really feeling the effects of this. The one thing I did notice is that the lower Rio Grande Valley didn't do too bad. The lowest temperatures, they were in the low 20s. They didn't see the teens or the single digits like we had seen in a couple of our other really bad cold outbreaks here in Texas. But for the rest of us, it was definitely cold. Next slide here. I wanted to show you some of the lowest observed temperatures for the week from some of the just selected cities around the state. Dallas-Fort Worth got down to -2 degrees. This was their third coldest temperature ever observed. Waco got down to -1. Houston got down to 13 degrees, one of their lower temperatures. San Antonio got down to 12 degrees. Midland was -2. That's among actually some of their coldest temperatures either. Austin saw 7 degrees. That was the 5th lowest temperature for Austin. Corpus Christi saw 17 degrees. And over in East Texas, Tyler saw -6 degrees. That was their coldest temperature ever observed in Tyler. Amazing. So again, this is historical cold. We'll move on to the next slide. I wanted to show the number of hours below freezing consecutive hours below freezing. Another way to show just how cold this was. Now, of course, freezing mark is just sort of an arbitrary mark because, we know that water freezes at 32. We could have picked, 20 degrees as well, and we would have seen somewhat a similar fashion. Areas across North Texas saw more than 200 hours below freezing, consecutive hours below freezing. Move on down in towards Central Texas, we saw somewhere around 140 to 160 hours below freezing. And then notice as you get down into the lower valley, things were not nearly as bad, but it was really from areas from south of San Antonio up to the Red River. A few locations saw their longest stretches of temperatures below freezing. An amazing statistic to see that. Even right here in Austin, we had about 144 hours below freezing, and it was the longest consecutive period below freezing temperatures we have ever observed, even right here in the capital city. Move on to the next slide. These were the numbers I had up there. You can see DFW had 139 hours. They had a small interruption on that Saturday. They went above freezing, but most areas across North Texas did not see that, and so they were well above 200. Like I mentioned, Austin had 144. San Antonio had 96 hours, their second longest streak on record. Houston had about 44. It was not among their longest, thank goodness. Waco had 205 hours. That was their longest stretch of consecutive hours below freezing. And Midland had over 200 hours, and it was their longest stretch of consecutive freezing temperatures as well. So on the next slide, I wanted to show you, this was a comparison that was done by the National Weather Service's Weather Prediction Center. They took a look at 1983, 1989, and the latest event, and we looked at the coldest temperatures, the departure from normal of the average temperatures for those three events. 1983 is on the far left, 1989 is in the middle, and 2021 is on the right-hand side. What they saw in this analysis, and this is just one way to look at this cold event, but when you compare it to temperatures below normal, we blew away 1983 and 1989. It was much colder. Temperatures below during this event were generally running about 25 to 35 degrees below normal across a good portion of the state, from Central Texas out to West Texas and up to the Red River. So while this was not necessarily our coldest event ever recorded in Texas, and it wasn't, it will probably be somewhere around third or fourth place. But when you compare it to departures from normal, where we should be in February, comparing it to these previous two very cold events, this was definitely the coldest. At least this is, when you use the measure of departure from normal. Let's see, go to the next slide if we can. One other thing I did want to mention, I talked about this early on, was the precipitation that came with this event. If you remember back in the 1989 event, the very cold event here in Texas, it was darn cold, but we didn't have precipitation to deal with. This one was a whole nother animal. This one featured some of the heaviest snowfalls we have seen in many parts of the state. This is a map right here that was showing the snow cover across much of Texas. And I'll just read you off a few statistics. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we saw about 4 to 5 inches of snow through this event. Out west in Midland, about 5 to 6 inches of snow fell. This was pretty heavy snow even for them. In San Antonio, about 3 to 4 inches of snow. Right here in Austin, we saw anywhere between 6 and 8 inches of snow. For Austin, this ended up being about our 4th greatest two-day total on record. That's pretty amazing. Del Rio, you may have heard, had almost a foot of snow. That was their heaviest snowfall total on record. Even Houston picked up an inch of snow and ice. Of course, all of this caused, very hazardous travel all around the state. And heavy snow was observed all the way south to LaGrange, where they had 4 to 6 inches of snow, even that far south. So this was an amazing storm, not only for the cold, but for the precipitation as well. So when you add those two together, this turned out to be an extremely horrendous event for our state. I did want to tell you that, like I mentioned before, this was not, at least from the preliminary numbers I've been looking at, this has not been our coldest event. In 1899, parts of Galveston Bay actually froze over. That's still probably going to be our coldest cold weather event, followed by 1983 and 1989. This one's going to be right up there with where we were in 1989, at least from the data I'm seeing right now. But again, it joins just a handful of years in Texas history that we have seen this magnitude of cold. And like I mentioned before, you throw in the precipitation, this makes this a whole unique event. The National Weather Service also put out this statement saying that February 12th through February 18th was the most extended period of below normal temperatures compared to these prior outbreaks. This is really significant too, as to note. So to sum it up, this was a really unique historical event for Texas. We have seen similar events like this in the past, but this one was somewhat unique in that it had all of that precipitation going with it as well. We saw some temperatures, the coldest ever. Other areas it was very close, and we saw some of the highest amounts of snowfall ever recorded in the state as well. So a very unique event. I hope something that we don't see repeat anytime soon. And I believe that's all my slides. With that, that concludes my presentation. Any of y'all have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. So you made a number of times the comment "ever recorded." Would make a statement and then "ever recorded," but you never gave a date of how long we've been recording these events.
Reliable records here in Texas go back to about 1895. Now, in some locations, we do have records that date back into the 1860s. Not much beyond that. That is very reliable. But a few spots in Texas have weather records going back to about the 1860s. But from the National Weather Service perspective, for reliable records around the state, about 1895 and forward.
So you're saying that these are the coldest, in some areas, the coldest temperatures we've seen since 1895.
Right. Correct.
And members, this is the type of information that we're trying to get. Because a lot of the comparison, I tried to read as much as I could. I wasn't out in the media on this event, and I kept hearing comparisons to 2011. And I would have, when you were making those statements, Senator Nichols, I was thinking, okay, well, maybe 1950. I would not have guessed the date you gave. So I appreciate that